Hey everyone. Welcome back to Strange Mind 6. I'm your host Ruby, and today we're going to be reading more of Chicken Soup for the Dog Lover's Soul. Stories of Canine Companionship, Comedy, and Courage by Jack Canfield, Mark Victor Hansen, Marty Becker, DVM, Carol Klein, Amy D. Shoja, and many more. But before we begin, please hit that like button, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. It would mean a great deal to me if you did. And honestly, without further ado, my dear friends, we're just going to get right into it. So grab a snack, or grab a drink, or just sit back and relax, and let's get to it. Daisy Love. In our early days of working together at the grooming shop, my husband David and I had a field day studying humanity as it passed through our door on the other end of a dog leash. Things were less hectic then. We had plenty of time to dissect our customers' personalities and discuss our observations. George was one of these character studies. Despite his gruff personality, he was a sentimental man, an uncommon trait in cool, reserved New England, where we strive to keep a stiff upper lip. George wore his heart on his sleeve, notably for Evie, his wife of 45 years, whose death after a lingering illness had been a traumatic blow to the craggy old gentleman. Each April, on the anniversary of Evie's passing, George would grace the editorial page of the local newspaper with a poem written in her memory. Every year about this time, we know we can count on two things, David remarked as he leafed through the paper: income taxes and a poem from George. I happen to think it's touching, I argued, and I'll tell you something else. If George doesn't get his dog to the vet soon, he'll have somebody else to grieve for. For almost a year, I had been upset whenever George brought his terrier mix Daisy in for grooming. I had noticed small lumps growing on her body, but each time I suggested he take the little Benji look-alike to the vet, he changed the subject. I agonized over the situation with David, who also worked as a psychiatric nurse. People like George will not act until they are ready, he told me. In the mental health field, we refer to this as denial. I empathized with George's dread. In his mind, if he didn't name the demon, it didn't exist. And Daisy was much more than a pet to a lonely widower. A heavy smoker and drinker in his younger years, George's retirement had been hastened by poor health, but now he worked at keeping fit. His daily walks with Daisy were a big part of his regiment. His life revolved around that little dog. There was the morning ride to the donut shop where Ruthie, the waitress, always served him a plain and Daisy a coconut cruller. I know it's not health food, but it's my only vice, he told me. Once home, they'd relax in his recliner to watch The Price is Right, then take a walk before lunch. After a nap, they arose in time to greet the school kids getting off the bus in front of their house. No matter what the chore, leaf raking, fence painting, bulb planting, or lawn mowing, Daisy happily tagged along at her master's heels as he addressed her with a steady stream of chatter. His pride in the little mongrel showed every time he picked her up after grooming. "Well, well, don't you look pretty?" he'd enthuse as Daisy wagged her whole body with delight. "Show us how you dance." The little dog dutifully twirled on her hind legs, then yippied for a cookie. "Show Kathy how you go for a walk," he'd tell her as she picked up the leash in her mouth and trotted to the door. "Now let's go visit your mother and show her those pretty bows." Off they would go to tend the flowers on Evie's grave. Another winter came and went before George got to the vet with Daisy. By this time the lumps were harder and larger. I felt a sense of grim foreboding when he said the vet had decided not to operate. He said she would be more comfortable if you gave her medicated baths. Somehow I did not believe those were the vet's only instructions. As the months passed, Daisy grew less energetic. She found it increasingly hard to stand, so I took to trimming her while she was lying down. She still performed her little tricks at the end of each visit. "Show Kathy how you act shy," he told her as she ducked her head and covered her eyes with her paw. When I returned from my summer vacation, my new assistant Trudy conveyed the news I had been dreading. Daisy had passed away. "George was very upset that you weren't here," she told me. "He even called the vet a quack. It got worse when he started crying." Unable to reach him by phone, I sent George a letter expressing our condolences. Months after, when he dropped by to see us, he looked as though he had aged several years. We reminisced about Daisy, her funny tricks and endearing ways. My son keeps telling me to pull myself together. If he tells me once more, "Dad, it was only a dog," all I could offer was a hug. "The worst part is, it was all my fault," he said tearfully. "I blamed the vet, but if I had taken her to see him when you folks told me to, I'd still have her now." David gently placed his arm around the old man's shoulder. "We've all learned some lessons the hard way, George," he told him. A few weeks later, fate intervened. When a young woman came into the shop dragging a dirt-caked terrier mix that was matted from head to tail, the raggedy creature's pungent odor told me it had recently gotten up close and personal with a skunk. "This here is Fanny. She belonged to my aunt and uncle, but they want to get rid of her." As I reached down to examine the dog, she jerked its chain. "Gotta warn ya, she's a bad dog. She barks all day, and she don't like kids." "She barks in the house?" I inquired. "No, she don't come in the house. They keep her tied out in the yard." Poor Fanny was frightened and jumpy. Grooming her was not easy or pleasant. When she emerged, defleed and deskunked, all her bones jutted from her bare skin, yet somehow she looked eerily familiar. "Who does she remind you of?" I asked David. "Sinead O'Connor?" he guessed. "No. Doesn't she look like Daisy, George's old dog?" It would take some convincing. George had sworn he would never get another pet. "I just can't go through it again," he told me. "I don't deserve it after what happened to Daisy." "But George, you know you've been lonely," I prodded, as determined as a used car salesman. "Everybody's lonely," he grumped. "What else is new?" "The poor thing spends her life tied to a rusty chain in a muddy backyard. She's totally unsocialized. I warmed to my subject. Maybe you shouldn't take her after all. She's going to need an awful lot of training, patience, and love. You might not be up for it. I guess I could take her on a trial basis, he mumbled. Well, if it doesn't work out, you can always give her back, I offered brightly. The first thing George did was rename the dog Daisy too. Her coat grew out, soft and fluffy, and she learned to walk on a leash and come when called. She still got anxious when he left her for grooming, then exploded in a yapping fury when he came to pick her up. Watch this, he said one December day, placing his car keys on the chair beside my counter. Daisy, wanna go get donuts? In a fury flash, she raced to the chair, jumping up and landing squarely at his feet, head cocked to one side, and keys gripped tightly in her mouth. George beamed proudly. David and I stood in the doorway watching the happy pair walk across the snow-dusted parking lot as the church bells chimed in a Christmas carol. Merry Christmas, George, I called after him. And don't forget, if it doesn't work out, you can always give her back. Kathy Salzberg. Aw, that's so sweet. I'm so sad about the first Daisy, but I know that she's in the Rainbow Bridge. But I'm glad that George got another chance with the second Daisy and actually helped her out of that horrible place she was in. I have a terrier mix myself, and I wouldn't be able to live without her. She's gonna be 10 this year, you guys. I can't believe it. Yeah, that's my Zelda. So, the next story is called Devotion. To your dog, you are the greatest, the smartest, the nicest human being who was ever born. Louis Sabin. The truck chugged into the parking space beside me in front of the supermarket and shuddered to a stop. Its rusty hinges protested as the man leaned his shoulder against the door to force it open. The truck was old, its red paint so faded and oxidized, 6 coats of wax could not have coaxed a shine from its ancient hide. The man, too, was old, stooped and faded like his truck. His washed-out red and black checkered flannel shirt and colorless trousers were a perfect match for the aura of age surrounding him and his truck. A farmer? I thought, judging by the leathery, tanned skin of his heavily lined face and gnarled, dirt-encrusted hands. The creases radiating from the corners of his eyes bore witness to years of squinting against the sun. As he stepped out of the truck, he turned to address the only youthful thing in the whole picture, a lively young Springer spaniel attempting to follow him. "No, lady," he said. "You stay here and guard our truck. I won't be long." He didn't roll up the window. Apparently, secure the dog would hold her post. As he entered the grocery store, the dog moved over to assume a position behind the steering wheel, her eyes following the man's progress. As the door closed behind him, she settled back on her haunches, staring almost unblinkingly at the closed door. The minutes passed. The dog did not move, and I began to feel her anxiety. "Don't worry, girl," I said. "He'll be back soon." I knew she heard me by the way her long, brown ears perked up, and the sound of her tail as it thudded and thumped a tattoo on the seat beside her. Her nose twitched, and the brown freckled fur covered her muzzle shivered in response, but her eyes never wavered from the scrutiny of the door through which the old man had disappeared. No Buckingham police guard could have maintained a more steadfast devotion to duty. Each time the market door opened, the dog stiffened in anticipation, settling back when the emerging figure was not the one for whom she waited. At last he appeared, carrying a laden plastic bag. The sedate little lady on guard duty erupted into a brown and white fury of pure joy. She yipped a series of sounds that could only have been interpreted as laughter. She chased her tail in a tight circle, sending up a cloud of dust from the dirt-encrusted seats. When he finally wrested the protesting door open, she launched herself at him, standing with her front paws on his shoulder, licking his face with great swipes of her pink tongue. The spray of white lines at the corners of the man's eyes disappeared as his crinkled face in response to her pleasure. His broad smile revealed strong, slightly stained teeth, probably the result of years of smoking, the scarred old pipe peeking out of his shirt pocket. Moreover, "Move over, lady. I'll drive now," he said as he gently pushed the dog to the other side and slipped behind the wheel. That did not end her display of affection. She jumped on him again, her tongue washing his face and ears, knocking off the old misshapen hat protecting his head. From her throat rolled a garbled stream of sound, a language only he understood. Taking her face in his hands, he ruffled the hair at the base of her ears, and looking into her eyes said, I know, I took longer than expected, but guess what I bought you?" Her hips stopped, their frantic swinging as she sat back, alert, watching his every move, as he pretended to search his pockets, and then the plastic bag, finally producing a pack of beef jerky. The dog licked her lips as he slowly tore open the package, removing at last a strip of hard, dried beef. Gripping it in his strong teeth, he let it protrude from the corner of his mouth as if it were a cigar. Her eyes never left the promised treat. She sat beside him, quivering with anticipation until he nodded. Then she stretched her neck and, using only her front teeth, pulled the blackened meat from his mouth. She didn't eat it immediately. Instead, she sat back, watching and waiting, drooling, as the jerky protruded from her mouth in the same way it had his. A small twitch in the corners of the man's lips as he took another piece, placing it into his mouth as he did before. They looked like two old crones settling back to enjoy a quiet cigar. I felt a smile spread over my own face. He nodded again, and the dog flopped down to begin enjoying her treat. He glanced over, seeing me for the first time. We both grinned sheepishly. I, for having been caught eavesdropping on a private display of a man's affection for his dog. He, for having been caught in the foolish little game he played for her. He snatched the beef strip from his mouth. As he coaxed his old truck into protesting life, I remarked, "That's a fine dog you have there." He bobbed his head and replied, "She's a real champion, all right." Giving me a parting smile, he backed out of the parking space. the old truck resenting every demand being made of it. I watched them as they drove away and noticed the jerky was back in the man's mouth. The dog, having wolfed down her piece, was sitting erect again, eyeing his share too. I was willing to bet she'd get the last bite of it before they reached their destination. And that is the end of this video, my dear friends. Tune in next video. This has been Ruby, signing off.